Welcome you. My name is Tom Reichert. I'm very honored to be the Dean of the College of Information and Communications here at the University of South Carolina. And on behalf of all of us in the college and our two schools, I just want to welcome you here tonight to the Buchheit Family Lecture. And I promise that you will not be disappointed. Even if you're a news junkie, you will learn something new about January 6th. Despite everything that you've been watching regarding the Congressional Select Committee, I guarantee it. So you will learn something new. Please pay attention. I want to especially welcome our new president, Dr. Michael Amaritis. President, welcome. Glad to have you here. I also want to acknowledge our former dean, Charles Bierbauer, who was, Charles was my predecessor, and he is the second longest-serving dean at 15 years in the program's almost 100-year history. Appreciate you making it here tonight. First, let me thank all of those who made this event possible. The college's special events team, Danielle McNaughton, J. Scott Parker, Megan Walker, and Austin Reed have just put in hundreds of hours. I've got to tell you, as you probably know, we're a little rusty after COVID. This is our first big event since about early 2020. And all of those staff members are new. So we're learning it all again for the first time. The Journalism School's director, Van Cornegay, I want to give him credit. It was his idea to honor our two alums tonight as part of the Buchheit Lecture. So thanks, Van, for that. I also want to thank the wonderful Buchheit family, who we're very pleased to have here tonight. Melanie and her two sons, William and Phil. Thank you so much. So this lecture series was created in 2000 to honor Phil Buchheit, a very good friend of the program. He was also the former president and chair of Mid-South Management Company and the former publisher of the Spartanburg Herald Journal. Newspapers and journalism excellence continue to run through the Buchheit family today, as it has for over 70 years, and we very much appreciate their generosity for making this event possible. Last, I want to thank my fellow dean, who I haven't seen yet, William Hubbard, for graciously allowing us to gather in this beautiful new facility. What a fantastic school that he has. So we're here tonight for two reasons. One is to recognize two very special alums for their reporting in both words and images on January 6, 2001. Work that earned them and their teams the coveted Pulitzer Prize. The Pulitzer, established from the estate of newspaper publisher Joseph Pulitzer, has come to symbolize excellence in American journalism. We're all so proud of you. Second, we also asked Josh and Wen to share with us tonight what they saw and how they covered the events at the Capitol that fateful day. Many Americans have found that day to be incredibly disturbing, to say the very least. However, many in our country continue to view those events differently. The role of journalism is to provide an unvarnished view of the truth. I look forward to hearing a firsthand account from our featured guests who were there. Wen and Josh, I just want you to know that Jim Hoagland, one of your fellow alums who earned 2 Pulitzer Prizes, was scheduled to be here and wanted to welcome you and introduce you himself, but he had some family issues to attend to. But he wanted me to personally congratulate you, and he asked me to remind all of us the Washington Post slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness." Now let me turn it over to one of our award-winning faculty members and the head of our journalism major, Nina Brooke, who will introduce our two alums and moderate the discussion. Thank you.
Good evening and welcome. If no one has done this yet, I would like to be the first to welcome you back to USC. Our two guests tonight, although it was in a time different from now and certainly in different circumstances, walk the walk that our undergraduate students walk every day. Learning here, growing in school, perhaps having some fun, and in their case, and in many of our students' case, aspiring to be journalists. Both of these men succeeded. Right out of school, they went to work in journalism. They both had remarkable careers before January 6th, 2021. And then on that day, they became involved in a story of a lifetime. In their work on and about January 6th, they achieved what is considered the most prestigious honor in our profession. We are, of course, proud of them, and we are very appreciative that they've joined us here tonight to tell us some of their amazing story. We will hear first from Josh Dawsey. Josh is a political and investigations reporter for the Washington Post, where he previously covered the White House. He joined the Post in 2017 after covering the White House for Politico and New York City Hall and New Jersey Governor Chris Christie for the Wall Street Journal. Dawsey is a member of the Washington Post team that won this year's Pulitzer Prize for Public Service. The Pulitzers called the Post's coverage a vividly presented account of the assault on Washington on January 6, 2021, providing the public with a thorough and unflinching understanding of one of the nation's darkest days. Dawsey is a 2012 graduate of the School of Journalism and a former student editor of the Daily Gamecock. Welcome, Josh.
It's nice to be with you all here, and nice to be back at the University of South Carolina. I graduated in 2012, and I was the editor of the Gamecock, where I covered the administration. Dr. Emeritus and Dean Bubauer might say I tormented them a little, but it's great to see you guys back here tonight, too. I'm incredibly grateful to the University of South Carolina, where I learned a lot about how to be a journalist. Some of my first lessons were here, particularly being the editor of the paper. I'm glad to see my family here tonight in the front row who drove up for this. And I really want to talk to you guys about what we did on January 6th and explaining our work. As Nina said, I now work on the political investigations team at the Washington Post, but I spent the entire Trump presidency following him around the world and the country as a White House correspondent of the Post. The work that we won the Public Service Pulitzer this year was a nexus of those two teams. The main component, as you'll see, there's me here. I think this is how I do it. Let's see. I guess I should have probably checked this. It's a three-part series we did on that day called The Attack. It started with the concept that we believe the congressional committees in early 2021 and the federal government were not providing a thorough accounting of what happened that day. And our editors, top editors of the Post, posed a challenge. And they said, why don't we do it ourselves? We shouldn't wait on Congress. We shouldn't wait on the Department of Justice. We should give the public the first detailed and thorough account of what happened that day, which was the worst attack on the U.S. Capitol since 1814. And it was too important because it was a city that really was at the core of what the Washington Post is. Attack was on Washington. It was on the federal government that we cover. Was on the city that we cover in a granular detail, and it felt like part of our public responsibility to tell everyone everything we could about this. And we wanted to do it in the most immersive and interactive way possible, which I'm going to show you a little bit in a second here. We kind of decided to collectively marshal the repertorial forces at the disposal of the Post that cover the intelligence community, the Secret Service, the White House like I did, the Republican Party, the Trump campaign, the Pentagon, the State Department, the various facets that go into the United States government. And we took a team of more than 25 reporters, and we wanted to show, along with designers, interactive folks, photographers. I'm looking forward to seeing some of your images that are so iconic of that day, to try and put together the most holistic package we could of what happened, to give a sense of there's a few institutions in American journalism that have the breadth and the repertorial aspects to be able to do this. And we wanted to show that we could, and we knew our readers deserved that. We knew there'd be some limitations to our work. We wouldn't have subpoena power like a congressional committee has or a federal investigation has. We wouldn't have, let's say, the resources of that sort of investigation. And we wouldn't have all the time in the world. I mean, our desire was to do the best thing we could as quickly as we could do it, right? And there's always this element in journalism where the further you go down reporting, the more questions you have and the more thoughts you have and the more things you want to pursue. And you have to decide, when are we going to take a shot at this and write this, and when do we need to keep doing research? So we were trying to balance a sense of being able to tell the best story we could while also doing it in a way that was timely for the American public. And those challenges were kind of compounded by the pandemic, frankly, because, you're putting together a team of probably 75 people in total at the Washington Post, many of them type A folks, many of them, strong personalities, strong ideas, strong egos, working on a project where for a lot of the time we were doing the work, there were no vaccines, we were not back in the office, and we were working remotely, and that caused a lot of challenges. But as I think I'll show you here, we were able to pull together something that we were all quite proud of, because it wasn't just of words and of print, which, the traditional way that people have consumed news, but there were interactive visuals and there were ticking clocks here. I'll show you in a second. When I scroll down, that let you go minute by minute through the day. So you could say what was happening at this time. In that time, we gave you a photo of what was happening in different worlds, tweets that were sent at a time, pictures that were sent at a time, audio components. We wanted our readers in this project not just to read something, but to feel like they were immersed in it, to see firsthand documents, to see the voices of the Secret Service folks as they whisked Mike Pence out of the Capitol and how afraid they were of his life, to understand the threats that came into the Pentagon, to understand the fears that election officials had from the voicemails, the very aggressive voicemails that were being left. The goal, and then we put everything in the bottom in footnotes, so we didn't have to put it down with our research, and you could go through the footnotes and find additional research, which is something the Post had never done really before. And the goal was to teach you through the story in various ways what was happening minute by minute. We put maps in so you could see where people were, how people got into the building. Anyway, if you have the time, take a time at some point to look at it, if you can. It's something that we put a lot of thought into, people that were way smarter than me, and how to do this. Because the project was about understanding the forces that propelled the attack. Why did so many people who previously had no criminal records become so radicalized to do this? Why was the intelligence community and the FBI and the Capitol Police so unprepared when these people were coming into the Capitol? Who spread these lies about the election, and where did they originate? How much money did people make off of spreading these sorts of claims? Why did the former president do this for so long? And more importantly, why didn't anyone in the White House try to stop it that day? Or at least the former president try to stop it? And why didn't other law enforcement get there sooner? Why did it take more than 3 hours to get a crowd out of the Capitol? I mean, those were kind of the core questions that we started wanting to answer. And we sat down and we made a detailed list of all of the things we wanted to know. More than 500 people that we wanted to talk to. A list of documents and reports that we thought might exist. We weren't sure what would exist, but we thought might exist. And tried to figure out every week or two what progress we were making. A small team of us who covered the Trump White House, Phil Rucker, Ashley Parker, and me, were focused heavily on the Trump White House, the Trump campaign, and the Republican Party. But we had lots of others on the Pentagon, Secret Service, the FBI, the Capitol Police, and we would come back every couple of weeks and report back to each other and figure out what we had learned. And most of the time when we did that, we found there were far more questions that our current reporting had found that we needed to go back and answer. All told, we talked to more than 200 people for this project and obtained hundreds of documents that had not been seen before, along with lots of text messages and audio that kind of helped us tell the story in a more compelling way. The piece ended up being 38,000 words. It's about half a book. One of the longest pieces of journalism the Washington Post has ever published. A lot of folks told me that they read it, but it took them a long time, which I definitely understood. I'm sure a lot of folks told me they read it and they didn't read it, but that's okay too. But there were many things we actually cut as well, because when you have a team of that many people bringing in so much information, you have to be somewhat discerning in what you actually include and what you didn't. And the kind of key findings that I'll go over quickly that we found through the reporting mission here was that Law enforcement officials had all sorts of warnings before January 6th and did not respond. Either they discarded them, they did not think that these people were actually serious, there were threats that were coming in all over, and they did not do anything about it. The Capitol Police, well, there were a lot of heroic officers that day who fought back as they were getting tear gassed and hit in the head, were broadly disorganized and unprepared for something of that caliber to happen. Pentagon leaders had fears but did not act on them for a variety of reasons. We watched in time how the former president talked about how the election was stolen, how many of his people gave money. They gave more than $250 million. It's one of the biggest fundraising things ever through these claims, and how they became radicalized. You saw over the time between Christmas and New Year's the number of people who were going online and asking for, we found all this traffic, people saying, I need a ride, I want to go to the Capitol. There were buses that were going. All of this was coming together. And while most of these people were peaceful and did not go into the Capitol, you could track how a lot of these people became radicalized in these far-right extremist groups. And then since then, how we looked in that day of why for 187 minutes, a lot of this is in the project of why the White House did not tell people to stand down for so long, and how they were still trying to make efforts to block the election results. And afterwards, we look at, how attacks have skyrocketed against election officials, and how now we have more than 300 candidates for office across the nation that say they do not believe the results of the election. So the point was not to just look at this day as a discrete day, but to explain the myriad factors that led up to it and what happened afterwards. There were 15 stories in a package. I only had bylines on 4 of them. Some of my colleagues had more. Some of them had less. But, it was truly a team effort. One of the things I think this package kind of symbolizes is that, none of us could do this kind of work alone, that it takes amassing the forces together to make it happen. For example, my colleague in January reported, got the exclusive audio of Trump telling the Georgia Secretary of State to find 11,780 votes. We did detailed reporting on how the Capitol Police were overrun and how they never had a chance of pushing back on this for various reasons of not having qualified officers, not having the backup that they needed. And then we looked in depth at the FBI and how the Department of Justice and the FBI were not even ready for this either. I'd encourage you to take a look at some of the work. I have so many colleagues who did so much valuable work in that period that I don't want to go through it all, but I would encourage you, if you can, to take a look at it. I'd say that working on this project at the Capitol was the proudest moment I've had in my years at the Post and in my career, because it brought us millions of readers who were desperate to know more, who really wanted to understand what happened that day. And frankly, a lot of people who subscribed, who had never read the Washington Post. I think we had more than 5,000 subscribers because of this project, because they really wanted to see something that they did not know. Of all the challenges that journalism faces, one of the truisms, if you give people fair and good and deeply reported content, they still are interested. They still want to read. And I think that's something that we really took away from this. And I think what we sought to do was to, put this in light, just as Wynn did, of letting folks see it for themselves. When you read the documents, when you can hear, when you can feel it, when you feel like you're there, you just have an acute understanding that it's hard to get otherwise. And yet there were so many questions we still had, so many questions that I think the January 6th committee still has, because some people haven't testified, some people haven't told the entire truth. There are some documents that still have not been obtained because they've been deleted or on different servers, and we weren't able to figure out everything we wanted, but we figured out everything we could in a time that we thought was fair to give it to the American public. I'll close my speech by saying this. I wasn't in the line of fire that day like Wynn was, and there were heroic colleagues of mine who were, and as the Capitol was breached, they felt the sting of a tear gas and saw the people with the weapons, heard the shots fired. Some of them saw the body of Ashley Babbitt, one of the writers, carried out of the Capitol. There was a lot of gruesome trauma there that day. But I remember a vivid moment when I was at home actually that day, and I remember a vivid moment when I realized things had changed. I was on the phone with the top spokesman to Mike Pence, and he was walking around the Capitol. They were preparing to certify the results. And all of a sudden, I heard windows shatter in the background. And he says, they've breached the Capitol. And I immediately called and told our editors, there were people inside the Capitol, and we knew that because they were right down the hall from him. And all of a sudden, you have Pence's team who got out about 90 seconds before they confronted the rioters who were yelling, "Hang Mike Pence." And they were put in a loading dock beneath the Capitol and surrounded by a phalanx of Secret Service cars. And in that moment, about 5 minutes before he was evacuated, I was on the phone with him, and he said, you could hear the people coming in to the Capitol and the cacophony that you've now, seen on TV. And that night, D.C. was so eerily quiet. It was a 6 p.m. curfew. They shut down the streets. It looked like a zombie movie. And when you were there, you kind of realized that things had changed, that this had been a seminal moment in our history, that something had happened that day that had never happened in our country before. And you could see the Black Hawk helicopters over backyards in D.C. You could hear, just the quiet of, it was so crazy out there at the Capitol, but if you looked in the rest of the city, the city had just shut down. I imagine, Dean Bierbauer, you lived around there during the 9/11 attacks and afterwards, and I think it was similar in that way, right? I mean, obviously this did not have a scope in the depths of that, but when the nation's capital just comes to a total standstill, I mean, it's really something to behold. Since then, that day, we've obviously written a lot about this. There's been the DOJ investigations. There's been the January 6 hearings. There's been lots of debate about the import of what happened and the politicization of a day's events. There have been trials and sentencings. There have been lots of people with a lot to say about it. But as we wrote in the Pulitzer Letter to the board, and I'll conclude with my remarks with this tonight, there's nothing more central to the American experiment than democracy. It has been a beacon for the world for nearly 250 years, and allowed a young nation to grow and prosper unlike any other. In 2021, that democracy came under attack from within. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. I did not know much about how your day had actually gone that day, and I found it interesting to hear from you how it unfolded for a working reporter in our Capitol that day. Win McNamee is the chief photographer news for Getty Images in Washington, D.C., a post he has held since 2004. He previously worked for Reuters and the state newspaper. McNamee's work has taken him all over the world. He is a 1985 graduate of our journalism school, and he also worked for the Daily Gamecock. His photography on January 6 was part of Getty Images' 2022 Pulitzer Prize for Breaking News Photography. The Pulitzers cited Getty's comprehensive and consistently riveting photos of the attack on the U.S. Capitol. Win.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Buchheit family for providing this opportunity. Dean Reichert, Dean Bierbauer, President Emeritus, thank you very much for having us. My wife is joining us here tonight, my daughter Ella, and her sister should be here soon if her flight gets in on time. Is this showing? It is. Okay, good. Let me start here and pull my notes. And I'm going to do this a little bit differently, I think, than Josh did. And there's 4 kind of primary points I want to try to make. But first, let me say it's wonderful to be back here on campus, back in Columbia. This is something I've been doing a lot more recently since Ella decided to come to school here. And I graduated from school from USC in 1985. And I'll add that I graduated on time, a point that people who knew me at that time probably would have wagered against. But while here on campus, I worked for the Daily Gamecock and part-time at the Columbia Record, an afternoon newspaper, which, yes, afternoon newspapers used to exist. And upon graduating, I worked at the state newspaper for a couple of years before returning to my hometown of Washington, D.C. to freelance. After that, I was hired by Reuters as a staff photographer in 1990, primarily covering the White House, and stayed there for 14 years before moving to Getty Images in 2004. So again, to sort of outline my talk, I'm going to try to talk about 4 primary areas. First, is, this is, oh, wait. How did this guy end up part of a team that won the Pulitzer Prize? Second, I hope to provide some context, in pictures, of course, of the years preceding the January 6th attack on the Capitol, as a way of showing some of the fractures that had developed and that have developed in our society. Third, I'd like to give a brief sense of our team's planning for our January 6th coverage, and a brief timeline, again in pictures, of my day at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Fourth, I'd like to provide a view of the winning Pulitzer entry with a little context around some of the photos in the submission and the process around that submission. So I arrived here on campus in 1981 as a typical freshman student, confused, homesick, somewhat directionless, frequently a bit fuzzy from late nights out, and often somewhat exasperated with the world around me. Fast forward 40 years, and I was at Columbia University in New York City just last week with Josh, accepting the Pulitzer Prize, in my case for breaking news photography, along with 4 of my colleagues from Getty Images. So how does one get from here to there? A student at USC to Columbia University. There's a lot of variables, of course, that go into that. I'm going to focus on one primarily, because the answer to me is fairly straightforward. I was fortunate in my early years in this business, many would say blessed, to be surrounded by some of the most generous professionals, both at this university, but also at the local newspapers where I worked while in college. There were many, these were my primary mentors. They were patient, kind, and exceedingly generous with a youngster eager to learn the business of photojournalism. All I needed to do was listen, learn, work hard, and produce. Again, that's listen, work hard, learn, and produce. It's amazing how far these 4 simple actions can take you. I have to mention a few of the names who were particularly instrumental during those years because these were the most important teachers I've ever had. Jeff Amberg, Tom Priddy, Joe Farmer, Mary Louise Miller, Ginger Pinson, Donna Baez, Vic Tutt, Tim Dominic, Perry Baker, Maxie Roberts, Doug Gilmore, Bobby Hitt, Scott Ferrand, Don Woolley, and Jack Hillwig. To these people and to the university, I owe so much. And it wasn't just the technical parts of the craft that I learned from these people. It was also the importance of being not only a good journalist, but also the importance of trying each day to be a good person. Those 2 aspirations do in fact go hand in hand. To these kind folks, I owe everything. They provided the solid foundation, an absolute necessity in the business of journalism that the rest of my career has been built upon. So to those people who are here this evening, thank you very much. So moving on to the, thank you. Moving on to the next section, context, warning signs in the preceding years. The years preceding January 6th were full of warning signs and events, both man-made and natural, such as the pandemic, that hinted at what our nation would face on January 6th. The signs were and remain all around us. It's sometimes difficult in the day-to-day course of events to link these events coherently to establish a broader narrative of what's occurring around us. Only time and perspective afford that opportunity. As a reminder, there were not so subtle signs of violent political extremism at a 2016 Trump rally in Virginia. We had the emergence of a new type of politician, a national politician, fixated on social media, self-aggrandizement, and fanning the flames of national discord. This new type of politician just so happened to replace the first African-American president. this is Trump at his inauguration, moments before he goes out on stage. We had the divisive and controversial and acrimonious nominations and confirmations, such as Brett Kavanaugh to the U.S. Supreme Court, that ensued in short order. We had political operatives like Roger Stone, around since the Nixon administration, on trial in the nation's capital. He would be the first of many to end up on trial. We had articles of impeachment, which were delivered from the House of Representatives to the U.S. Senate twice. We had the pandemic, when many Americans were terrified to leave their homes and were afraid of running out of literally everything. We had reporters, whoops, I skipped one. I'm out of order, sorry. We had couples getting married during the pandemic and churches that were empty. We had the pandemic itself. We had reporters at the White House asking questions while wearing rubber gloves. We had a president who consistently played the victim. We had longtime trusted public servants publicly diminished and ridiculed by the office of the presidency. We had a president returning to the White House from his own bout of COVID, turning his return to the White House into a theatrical event. We had a president charging ahead with his political rallies in the middle of the pandemic in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and then firing his campaign manager for not filling up the rally site. And of course, we had the murder of George Floyd and the ensuing Black Lives Matter movement that inspired millions of Americans to take to the streets in protest. And this is just in D.C. These were all over the country. We had military and police presence across the U.S. in response to these protests, leading to the largest domestic military operation other than war in U.S. history. We had competing rallies, people endorsing the Second Amendment and other ideas in Richmond, Virginia. We had the strangest political conventions ever due to the pandemic in the 2020 presidential election. We had more dystopian imagery provided by allusions to The Handmaid's Tale than I ever want to see again. So, This is the atmosphere that preceded January 6th. After 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency and an additional year of him campaigning for the office, it's fair to say that those of us covering the news in Washington were, 1, exhausted, 2, somewhat hardened to the daily machinations emanating from the White House, 3, expecting trouble on January 6th. What you see on the screen here is the first part of a planning schedule sent to our team members the night before January 6th. Our first priority, always, everyone's safety. Reading through the schedule now, it seems somewhat naive in light of the day's events. Our news team had been planning for January 6th for weeks. Our coverage plan included 2 distinct teams, a team covering the rally, where President Trump was scheduled to speak, and another team covering the official events inside the U.S. Capitol, where electoral ballots were scheduled to be certified. While we anticipated that the crowd from the rally would march toward the Capitol at the conclusion of the rally and demonstrate there, we never considered the possibility that this crowd would directly attack one of the 3 branches of the U.S. government. The first photo that I took that day was at 7:53 a.m. This is just a simple scene setter type photo. We're trying to provide our clients imagery to illustrate the day that's coming ahead. it was, fairly quiet outside. People were showing up early. And later in the day, the Senate and the House at 1 p.m. were scheduled to meet jointly in the House chamber to certify the electoral ballots, where objections to the certifications were raised almost immediately. At this point, the two houses of Congress separated to debate the merits of the objections independently, with senators returning to the Senate chamber. The debate period was expected to last hours. Due to technical problems during the joint meeting, I needed to leave the House side of the Capitol to file pictures from an office we use, which is on the Senate side of the Capitol. While walking there, I noticed the crowd from the rallies beginning to form on the west front of the Capitol, and it was growing by the minute. Within 15 minutes, the crowd had breached the barricades on the perimeter of the Capitol and were literally climbing over the site of the presidential inauguration that was under construction, scheduled to be used in just 2 weeks' time. I tried to contact members of our outside team to confirm that they were in position to cover the crowd on the west front. I couldn't reach anyone. Lines were jammed. Photographers were moving with the crowd. They were all busy shooting. Communications were one of our biggest problems. At about the same time, I began to hear the first shouting within the building, along with an announcement over the Capitol PA system, warning everyone to shelter in place. A police officer came to the door of the office where I was working with several other photographers. The police told us to lock the door. Instead, we all grabbed our cameras, left the office, and headed in the direction of the commotion down one flight of stairs. And this is the first picture I made of the crowd entering the Capitol. It's in the Ohio Clock corridor, just outside the Senate chamber. There we encountered a group of about 30 to 40 members of the crowd facing off with members of the Capitol Police. I'm going to show just sort of raw pictures here, unedited, nothing fancy, just to sort of give a sense of the scene. Eventually, police were outnumbered significantly. I worked the scene in this area, in the corridor, in an adjacent area for about 10 minutes, and then started sending photos to our New York editors directly from the camera via Wi-Fi. The process was frustrating as transmissions were hit and miss and on and off, frequently needing to be repeated. My phone was blowing up, and seemingly everyone I'd ever met thought this was an ideal time to text me. Around me, it was chaos. Members of the crowd were wearing military-style protective equipment, chanting political slogans, confronting police directly, and coursing through the building with abandon. I've covered Washington for 30 years. The Capitol, love it or hate it, is a special place, one of the primary symbols of our republic. I never imagined a scenario such as the one surrounding me. The rotunda of the Capitol was literally overrun with members of the crowd who had forced their way into the building. People were streaming in from all directions. Capitol security had been completely breached. I continued to send files from my camera for the next 90 minutes or so, occasionally returning to the office where I had been working for brief periods to slowly begin to gather equipment and to check in with my editors. It seemed just a matter of time before press would be forced to evacuate as law enforcement attempted to regain control of the building. After photographing a melee between members of the crowd and police at the east door just outside the rotunda, I followed a large group to the third floor of the Capitol. Along the way, one of the members of the crowd looked at me and asked, somewhat aggressively, who I worked for. I said, Getty Images, and pardon my language, but he said, I don't know what the fuck that is, but it's not CNN and it's not the New York Times. And so I think they were probably looking for folks from those organizations. When members of this group involved in the melee at the east door reached the third floor, they began to move toward the Senate chamber. Doorkeepers had left in such a hurry that the doors to the Senate to the Senate chamber on the third floor had been left unlocked. The crowd pulled open the doors and began streaming into the chamber. After a few minutes, I overheard a few of them talking about how to unlock the doors on the first floor so they could reach the actual Senate floor. One of them said he thought he could drop down from the balcony. On the second floor, a drop of about 20 feet. I moved to a position where I could see this, and sure enough, the guy climbed over the balcony and lowered himself slowly in an attempt to decrease the distance between himself and the floor. Dangling by one arm, he let go, hit the floor hard, and then proceeded to unlock the doors on the first floor. Within minutes, people were streaming onto the floor of the U.S. Senate, going through desks, posing for photos. They seemed generally quite pleased with themselves. In the middle of all of this, I get a text on my phone. It's me. And then it's followed by a tweet from my daughter. Which added a much-needed moment of levity to the situation. I returned to the hallway just outside the Senate chamber to send more pictures to our editors. I made one more trip to the rotunda after this and was caught in between members of the crowd and the police and was almost forced out with the crowd as police began to retake control of the building. Fortunately, a member of the U.S. Capitol Police recognized my press credential and pulled me out from the members of the crowd. Within the next 10 minutes, we were evacuated from the building. Members of the House and Senate reconvened later that night, twice, to officially certify the electoral ballots. These pictures are actually from an area in the Capitol complex where the Senate convened outside the Senate chamber. And these are not people you normally see at the U.S. Capitol. But this is from the evening session where they met twice to finally get around to certifying the election of Joe Biden. And things had changed. The atmosphere definitely felt different in the evening. The last photo I took that night, this picture, was at 3 a.m. So, fourth part, Pulitzer entry. The funny thing is, I'm incredibly superstitious. I know it's silly, but I am. Whenever, in the aftermath of January 6th, whenever anyone mentioned the word Pulitzer, I just shut them down immediately, because I don't want to hear about it until it's time to actually put the package together. It's bad luck, it's bad juju. I knew we had strong material. I knew other organizations had strong material. I knew we had a chance. I also knew that it was going to be close. So I've entered photo contests my entire life, well, not my entire life, but since I've been in this business, and I've entered hundreds of times. That's what photographers typically do. The Pulitzer is not a photo contest. It's a journalism contest. Everyone on our team wanted this to be the best submission we've ever entered. The winning edit that you're going to look at is comprised of 15 photographs produced by 5 people. The editing team that put this together was comprised of 8 people. There were 5 editors and 3 photographers contributing to the editing process. It's painstaking, and at times it becomes difficult to move forward past disagreements about the package. These things happen. Ultimately, it's a good sign because it means everybody cares deeply about the submission. But it's also difficult to describe the level of tension related to getting a package like this to its final version. There's my daughter. Yeah, she deserves a round of applause. Yeah. And this is where everything sort of comes full circle again, back to all those lessons learned forever ago, both at USC and the local papers here in Columbia. Listen, learn, work hard, produce. Be a good journalist, but be a better person. By doing those simple things, you can achieve quite a bit. You can get past most bumps in the road. By doing those small things, you can figure out solutions to almost any troublesome situation. Those are the words that I'd like for any journalism students in the audience to take home this evening. Listen, learn, work hard, produce. Be a good journalist, but be a better person. Thank you.
Wynn, were you afraid that day?
No, I was lucky. You know, I was not aware of what was going on in other parts of the building. I had a couple of interactions that I would say were not the most pleasant, but no, I never felt. I never felt really threatened.
What about since then?
Well, subsequent to that day, my primary concern was the security and safety of my family, because I was concerned that there might be some type of retribution, because a number of people were arrested and put in jail because of the photographs that we took that day.
Mm-hmm. Josh, what about your personal interactions with Donald Trump? What was that like?
How long do we have? No, I interacted with him many times over the 4 years that I covered him, and since recently as a few months ago. Interviewed him maybe about a dozen times, flew with him all over the world. There's a little bit more there than people see. I think in private, he often is a little bit more charming and charismatic than you might think he is in public with some of his angry tirades. I think as much as he attacks the media, there's a lot of a desire from him to want us around, to want good coverage, to want favorable coverage. I think he's probably did more interviews than any former president, but he also, had a lot of pernicious rhetoric. I think that hurt the media standing. That led to a lot of folks being threatened, as you said. He is a very I guess the best way I would put it without saying, without going on too long, is that a lot of it is what you see is what you get with him, but there is also a lot going on always behind the scenes with him, where his public rhetoric is not exactly what he's doing behind the scenes. I mean, he's, so I'll just tell one quick story. I mean, there were times when he would be on Air Force One on a Saturday night, and he would just start calling reporters, right? I mean, you would be out at dinner, you'd be wherever, and it would be the President of the United States wanting to talk to you. I mean, we came to the Oval Office and met with him, and he brought out, the famous Kim Jong-un letters and wanted us to read them and tell him how great the letters were as, he continued holding his meetings. I mean, a lot of the public interactions with him, he's always selling himself, and he's always selling something.
So I'm about halfway through Maggie Haberman's book. Speaking of reporters who he calls, and she does relate that side of him, I think, that you're talking about. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, you have not written a book.
I have not, no.
And that makes you one of the few, I guess. That's been a little bit controversial. What do you think about this controversy about journalists who've been, I guess, accused of holding back some of the tidbits for their book?
Well, I think a lot of that is unfair. I mean, when you're doing a holistic project like a book that takes a year or two, you have different agreements with the sources you talk to. A lot of folks you talk to will be more forthcoming, even for a project like ours, than they will in the day-to-day agreements. And I would recommend Maggie's book to everyone. It's really quite good. But when you're writing a book, you have different amount of time you're able to spend with people. You have different agreements with people. A lot of folks will say, I'm telling you this for your book. I'm not telling you this for the newspaper, because when you tell someone in real time, it often leads to colleagues accusing them of leaking to the press. It often leads to all sorts of recriminations. But when it comes out 2 years later or a year and a half later, it's a little bit different. So I understand why people feel that way. I understand that in some of these cases they think, if this information was related now, it would have made a difference. I'm not sure that I agree on a lot of that, and I think it's always a little bit more complicated when you know what goes into reporting a book or a project like that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So when you mentioned Tom Pretty, and I had seen something that was in our coverage of your award, I guess, where Tom Pretty said you were a natural, that he did not have to teach you. And of course, the framing of your images and just the mood and that type of thing. I mean, are you a natural? How do you do that in the moment when you have to create news and art together like that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know that natural really applies to anybody doing anything. I think you have to work at it. I was lucky. My father was a photographer, and so I was around photographs my entire life, and sort of exposed to that at every turn, whether consciously or subconsciously. But that's sort of what I was getting to too. I mean, that's 40 years ago. I started doing this here, and over 40 years, I think, contrary to what Tom might have said, things that I learned both working at, say, even the Daily Gamecock or Columbia Record or the state newspaper, all of those things accumulate over time, and it gives you the ability to, when you're in a somewhat pressure-filled situation, to be able to keep operating and to be able to keep your wits about you, because it becomes automatic, I think. You've done it so many times.
Yeah, well, and I wonder if you've thought about you and your father. I think over the span of 70 years of American history, you have captured what is in our minds about events. Do you ever think about the two of you together and your role in the span of history that way?
Not too much, to be honest, but I mean, I was fortunate that I was able to work with my father for a number of years. For about 10 years. From about 1990 to 2000. And I haven't really given myself the opportunity to sit back and think about things in the way that you've mentioned, but, I was always quite struck, in awe of his work ethic and his ability to relate to people, that he was not only colleagues that you're working with, but subjects that you're covering. And that's sort of like, again, what I was sort of getting to about be a good journalist, but be a better person, because they go together. Mm-hmm. Like if you spend the time to get to know somebody and learn their story, everything opens up.
Yes.
And he was fantastic at that.
Yes.
So.
One thing that I guess we look at the journalism school as we are sending people out into the world is, the changing business model of journalism. And I ask the two of you that because you are each in sort of a unique situation. You don't work for a paper, right? You don't work for a news outlet. And in contrast, you currently work for a deep pocket, which has changed, I guess, what the Post can do. And I wonder if each of you would sort of think about how you're working as a journalist now and what it says for the future of the profession and the business.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that I wanted to show the project and the immersive outlines that we did is that, a place like the Post once had almost 1 million print subscribers and now has maybe about 200,000. But we have now 3 million people who subscribe online and millions of viewers who come every day, between 1 and 2 million every day who look at our website. So the decisions that once were made for print newspapers of what's going to go on the front page on Sunday, what's going to be above the fold, how are we going to show this in print, now really are secondary to what you see online. And we spend a lot of time thinking about how are things going to look on an iPad, how they're going to look on a phone. I mean, I've traveled the country and spoken to various classes and places, and I always ask the students, how do you read the news? And no one says newspaper, right? I mean, there's a few dinosaurs still left reading the newspapers. I actually like a newspaper, but and I'm sure some of you do too, but there's not many left. So we really have thought about it in a different way, of trying to present news to people where they are. I mean, at the Post, really in the past few years, since Jeff Bezos bought the Post, the newsroom has almost doubled in size. We now have about 1,100 journalists at the Post from about 600 about 8 years ago. And a lot of that has been expansion because we have the financial resources to make it work. I mean, when Bezos bought the Post, he told Marty Barron, our editors, and others, I'm not doing this for charity. I mean, I want this to be a profitable enterprise, but we had enough money to make those sorts of digital investments to create a newsroom that was prepared to suit, the future. I mean, we now have, entire teams called Next Generation who are studying where people are getting the news and where they are and figuring out how we get to them. So it's really kind of a changing equation at all times, but it's certainly that the way we traditionally make decisions about news. I mean, what we spent probably more time on this project or the Post-it, about as much time figuring out how to present it. I mean, how are we going to take these words and put them in the most compelling way so people will actually engage with the work?
So Getty is, Getty Images is it's a young company, and they have actually figured out a new business model, I think, that allows us to do journalism in a way. It's hard to describe actually because it's a very kind of big, complex company. But I mean, newspapers like the Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times, they all subscribe to our images, our pictures. They take direct feeds, and it's interesting too. It's, when I started working for Getty in 2004, I would show up at assignments, and sometimes people were like, "What's that?" And now it's like everybody knows, and it's a generational thing too. It almost, I think, like, I don't know where the cutoff is. I would guess it's probably 45 or below or something. But like all the kids, like my daughters, I think, and their friends, they know what Getty Images is. My daughter's always stealing my Getty Images T-shirts and sweatshirts so she can wear them around, because I don't know why, but they think it's cool. So it really is. It's far too complex to sort of get into that whole business model at a venue like this. But I'm grateful every day that they have figured this out. I would suspect that absent Jeff Bezos' pockets, that other organizations are going to have to find other ways of doing something similar, because it's a really tough market right now.
Right.
I mean, it's incredibly tough.
Right. Well, and I think I saw you a couple of summers ago, and you mentioned Getty actually ended up being well placed the way the journalism world is today, because perhaps
Correct.
people do not have the staff photographers in the numbers that they had, and so they need something like Getty that can provide them those images.
It's the declining revenue, advertising revenue, newspapers across the country has not been a good thing for
Yes.
journalists
Yes.
as newspapers, traditional print publications try to make the lines add up.
Yes, I also love a real newspaper, although I subscribe to you digitally, so I'm in
I
your,
read it.
We thank you
I
very
read
in your
much.
millions
print
who
form
subscribe
every morning.
digitally. We do have time for some audience questions, and I know we have some journalists and possibly future journalists, and there are two microphones that I can barely see, and there are some humans, I think, moving toward them. So if you would like to ask either of our guests a question, we would just ask that you go to the microphone to do so.
In the interest of time, why don't they'll raise their hand and I'll come to them.
Okay.
Okay.
Personal delivery by the director of the journalism school. Someone get this on film.
Hey, some of those images y'all took, I mean, it was like, some of them almost brought tears to my eyes, honestly. But I was just going to ask, as I'm born and raised in a small town, very conservative, and I just wonder, like, what would you say is like the best way to convince people of the importance and severity of the January 6th insurrections? I mean, it's just, I've tried to help, and I get y'all have like all the stuff to like share, but some of them are just really stubborn.
No, it's all yours.
Well, let me ask, do people...
Who would you like to answer this? Him, right?
No, that's a really hard question. I mean, people are going to believe what they want to believe, I think, absent, even presented with, imagery, facts that show otherwise, right? But again, I think that's, goes to the importance of the work that this giant package that the Post put together, which is, remarkable, and it's how comprehensive it is, and also the lasting impact of still photographs that were created that day. But ultimately, if somebody wants to believe, the sky is orange, and even though it's blue, they're going to say it's orange. I don't know what you do.
But I think a lot of it is also giving people what we wanted to do in our package to get past some of the politicization is to show people things for themselves, to show them documents, to give them audio that they could hear, to see photos that they could see. You know, one of the things I think that builds trust among readers of our outlets is when you give people original source material and let them see it themselves. I mean, if you look through Wynn's photos, you look through some of the stuff we put in our package, I mean, you can't tell people what to think, and you don't want to do that, but you want to show them exactly what happened in the most clear way you can. And if they question your work, to say, here's the evidence, look at it for yourself, see it for yourself, right? I think that is when we're most successful as an industry, is when we are giving people a comprehensive, detailed, everything we know with all the evidence we have to back it up. And then I think past that, that's really all you can do.
I'm Alexis at the journalism school, graduate school. I have two questions. I have a first question and a follow-up question that kind of goes with the first question. I had to write it down because I didn't want to forget. What did you experience that the media has taken and has portrayed with an inherent bias towards a partisan view that was actually quite different in its actual perspective? So,
Could you repeat that? I'm not sure I understand it.
so what did you experience that, like, at the January 6th insurrection, that the media has taken and portrayed with an inherent bias towards like their partisan view that was actually quite different in its actual perspective? And then my follow-up question is related to that. It's basically...
Maybe we try your second one first. I'm kidding.
So you could try the second one first. But it's there has been different accounts on both sides saying that there was a storming of the Capitol versus the stance that they were allowed in. From your camera's viewpoint and what your camera saw and what you witnessed, what actually happened, just to clear the air so that people can see this and, you know, because I'm recording it.
I think it's very similar to what we answered before. I mean, there's video of they were not let in. You don't break a window if you've been invited in. You don't tear down barricades if you've been let in. You know, I think it's the same answer.
I think there were varying people, right, who broke windows and knocked things over and hurt cops, and then other people who just followed those people in, right? So I think there are gradations of how people got into the Capitol, but this was not a peaceful tourist visit. These people were not showed a red carpet and said, please come into the Capitol, right? I mean, you can watch a video of how they got the doors knocked down and the windows knocked down, and how the people climbing through the windows, people, you know, running over security guards and officers. You could hear the, you know, audio from the police radar and the transmission screens where they're trying to stop these people from getting into the Capitol. I mean, I'm sure there are people who, you know, had the door open for them and walked in behind others, or people who the barriers were already knocked down, so they just walked in. I mean, I don't think everyone who went into the Capitol that day was violent by any stretch of the imagination. There were some who were quite violent and others who were not, but they were not. No one was welcomed into the Capitol that day. Oh, take that one if you want. I guess you saw there were people using selective parts of remarks and things that happened where, and presented in a fuller totality, you would have a better picture of what happened, right? I mean, I think there were efforts by some to downplay what happened that day by only using parts of it. I think there were efforts to show, you know, maybe only the most violent parts in other ways. I don't know, do you agree or disagree with that, Wynn?
I didn't see too much that obviously there were, I think there was an effort in some quarters to sort of create a narrative that was contrary to the truth. But we've seen that movie many times. And I tend not to pay too much attention.
Okay, Mr. Cornegay is going to get the one last question with the microphone there.
This is a question for Wim. At the beginning of your presentation, you described an environment that, to my knowledge, does not exist in Columbia anymore for photographers. And I imagine this is true for a lot of cities and towns in the United States. What do you suggest for up-and-coming photojournalists, multimedia, digital, whatever the name is for people like you in the future?
Right.
Like, how do you encourage them to follow a path that follows the same sort of quality and commitment to the truth that photojournalists today and in the past have held to?
Right. That's a very good point. It's a good question. Because we were just discussing how newsrooms have been shrunk over the last 30, 40 years. I think there is still some ability to do some of that on a smaller scale, but I can't speak to what writers have done, but photographers have gotten very creative, I think, in terms of finding ways to continue to make a living doing what it is that they love, and it's every town's got handfuls of people who are engaged in that kind of work, and it's locating mentors and like-minded spirits, if you will, to fill the same kind of role. And you're right, it's not as easy as it was, but I think it can still be done. It takes a lot more research and investigation, I would say.
Okay, additional question.
Sorry, I thought I was off the hook. All right.
No.
It's often said now that we no longer believe in a core set of facts. So if that's the case, how do we empower truth tellers? Is there some sort of system that may be developing to set some sort of standards, ratings, something that would be accepted beyond our current dialogue of who's controlling the narrative back and forth? It's kind of like we have the health department come out and assess our restaurants. Why do we not have a system to assess where we consume our news?
Yeah, I'd say for the first part of that question, I don't know that we want a system that way. I mean,
Fair.
I don't think you want the government telling you what sort of news to consume. In fact, I think that would be kind of an antithesis to what we want to do as a profession. I mean, I think there certainly is a polarization where you see a lot of the highest rated programs, a lot of the highest read things come from a partisan point of view. People tend to want to read and find things that comport to what they believe in. I guess the thing that I would say back to that is, deep, important journalism that, like, when did the day that we, I think, did on that in the months after my team, I think transcends some of that. I think people, maybe they don't go in agreeing or believing, but you get them to look at what you do, and you hope that they can see the other side. I'm not saying that everyone who read our project or looked at Wynn's photos, took away the same thing. I'm not even saying they would want to, but I do think when you present a comprehensive look at something that really tries to answer folks' questions, where you're not being condescending to them, where you're trying to be educate them, where you interact with them. I mean, a lot of what we do at the Post is trying to build a bigger audience, and doing Q&As with readers, finding readers where they're at, presenting more evidence and stories. I agree with you that it sometimes feels like in this country there's not, a shared set of facts. You look at how people responded to the pandemic, look at how people responded to what happened last summer with, George Floyd and the protests and riots afterwards. But I think people probably have a little bit more in common than the extremes of either side would say, right? I mean, you have, I don't think most of the people who are Republicans in this country storm the Capitol like that, right? I don't think most of the folks who are Democrats are also far left either. I think sometimes those sides get the highest amount of attention because they're the loudest, but I do think there's some middle ground, maybe not as much as it used to be, that still exists. tell me I'm an idiot if you disagree
No,
with
I
me.
agree with everything you said. I don't really have anything else to add to that. I think you did a terrific job answering it.
Yeah, because that's a tough question. That was a good question.
Within the last week or so, I think Neiman Lab had a report that said higher income Americans are willing to pay for subscriptions, to pay for higher quality vetted news. Do you worry that the news product will become something that is an elite product and not necessarily something shared by Americans?
I mean, we have to find a way for people to pay for digital news. I mean, people all the time will tweet back at me or email and say, the story's behind a paywall, and I say, yeah, do you expect to, I'd say this kind of curtly, but do you expect to go in a gas station and get gas for free? You don't. It's a service. Gathering news, like Wynn did that day, like our team did that day, we spent probably $10-20 million on a project like this, putting in the resources, travel, hiring all sorts of folks. It's good journalism. You look at the war in Ukraine right now and how expensive it is for news organizations to cover that war. You can't cover that unless people are willing to pay for it. And I think, at the Post, we have teams that are committed to covering poverty in America, committed to covering the inequities in America, committed to trying to tell the story of a whole country. I think it's something we're cognizant of and really try and do. But there's not a world in which journalism organizations can exist at a high level if people are not willing to pay for the news on some level, just because it's so expensive to do some of these things.
Yeah, it's interesting. People will pay $9.99 a month for Hulu or Disney Channel or Netflix or whatever it is, but for some reason they don't want to pay for probably the most important thing that we could use right now, and it's a strange situation that we find ourselves in, and I don't know the answer to it. I look back to the way the 2016 presidential election was covered as kind of an example of that. It's like, you want free, you're getting Facebook, you're getting Twitter, right? Which is not necessarily a great route to head down. And also the sort of easy fixation on one candidate who happened to be the most bombastic. You end up with round-the-clock coverage of one guy on free TV kind of news. But, to really get meaningful, rich, deep information, you need to pony up for, the Washington Post or...
Thank you. We appreciate that.
The New York Times or...
We appreciate that very much.
Right. Well, thank you. I think in seeing both of your work and hearing the things that you've said tonight, we all can be very proud that the two of you are out representing our school as working journalists and the way you carry yourself and do your work. I think tonight also shows the value of the Buchheit Lecture, and we again say thank you for the support of that. We thank you for being here, Dr. Emeritus, and all of our other guests, and on behalf of the College of Information and Communications, thank you and good night.